Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. On Wednesday, Canada became the largest economic power on the planet to legalize marijuana. Some people argue that this move could alter the political, social, cultural, and economic fabric of the nation, much like the prohibition and lifting of the prohibition on alcohol did for the United States. While provinces within Canada will have leeway to determine all kinds of regulations, from whether pot will be sold in government stores or privately, where it can be smoked and consumed, and at what age you can use it or not use it, it is legalized everywhere around that country. Most of the states within the United States that border Canada have either legalized or medicalized marijuana. Here's where the problem around reefer begins between these two seemingly allied nations. The U.S. Customs Service and Border Patrol are denying entry to anyone Canadian who has ever used marijuana now or in the past, along with all those who are involved in the growing Canadian marijuana industry. This is the Trumpian response that is akin to what George Bush did in 2003 when he threatened to tighten the border if Canada legalized marijuana. This act by the United States to retaliate against Canada's legalization of marijuana not only has affected thousands of Canadians, but is a concern to many U.S. border cities, towns, and states who rely on Canadian commerce and tourist dollars. Joining us to look at all of this is San-Ho Tree, director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And San-Ho, welcome to the Real News. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, this, in a broad context here, talk a bit about what this actually means for Canada. I mean, this is a huge move. This is a huge economic power in the world, legalizing marijuana on the border of a country that does not, except what states do. So what does this mean for both Canada internally and externally, from your perspective?
Well, as Trevor Noah said last night on The Daily Show, Seth Rogen can finally try weed. It's finally an acknowledgement that 40% of Canadian adults have used marijuana in the past. And it serves no purpose to stigmatize them, to criminalize them. And in fact, with this legalization measure, those that have had prior convictions for possession of 30 grams or less will get those convictions expunged now. That's really important for job prospects, for travel abroad, for other things like that. So that's a great step forward. But it also means that Canada is now regulating cannabis, whereas in most of the United States, it's still the province of the black market and very often criminal groups. And so you can't regulate that which you deliberately drive underground. And by regulating this, by legalizing it in Canada, they're actually protecting youth. Right? Because if you ask any kid in the United States, for instance, what's easier to obtain, marijuana or alcohol, it's almost always marijuana, because we choose to regulate alcohol. We give legitimate alcohol store owners every reason not to sell to minors. You'll be arrested, you'll get prosecuted, you'll be disgraced, every manner of calamity will befall you if you do this. But here we're going to give you a workable livelihood. You can make a reasonable amount of money in a regulated alcohol store. And so people generally tend to enforce those policies themselves, and that works. Whereas if you go to the black market, the dealer who sells the kid marijuana might as well sell something more addictive to get a repeat customer if their only concern is maximizing profits. The other benefit of legalization is now you can get testing of cannabis before it reaches the market. We learned how important this was. I was shocked when Colorado legalized in 2012, and they finally implemented, the pot shops and the stores. And they tested the cannabis before it went into market, before it was manufactured into edible goods and stuff. And they found that a lot of these growers who had all these years claiming that they've been growing their cannabis organically hadn't been. They'd been using very risky and sometimes prohibited pesticides to control fungus, to control insect infestations, which happens when you grow monocultures of any sort. It's like a giant buffet when the right predator comes along, the right invasive species. And so they use a lot of these industrial strength chemicals. Now, unlike vegetables and fruits, which some of these chemicals are approved for, we do not wash our cannabis before smoking it, right? They smoke it directly. So people have been ingesting this stuff and directly into their lungs. And I don't think most people want pesticides in their lungs. And so that gives people an incentive then to go to state pot shops in Canada rather than rely on the black market, even though they might try to undersell the state stores in the short run.
This is a total digression. Has there ever been a study about how many people consume marijuana that has been tainted with all these chemicals and pesticides in this country and any others?
It's been going on for decades, and I don't even want to think about it. When you have these outdoor grows and indoor grows that are underground,
Yeah.
it's just too easy for these growers to reach for the industrial strength chemicals rather than use organic means. And there are many organic means, but they're slower. Sometimes they're a bit more labor intensive. But you can grow this stuff without using these chemicals.
So, going back, one of the things I was reading this morning about the legalization in Canada is that the Canadian Medical Association and others really seem to oppose this, saying Canada hasn't gone far enough to protect citizens in Canada from the consequences of legalization. I mean, what can you tell us about that debate and what that means? I've never really heard that debate. I didn't hear it in Uruguay where they debated, where they legalized it earlier. I've heard a little bit about that in some places like Holland, but what do we know about that?
Yeah, Seth Rogen never had a problem dating cannabis in Canada, and most Canadians don't, even before ending prohibition. So they have been using it.
Is Seth Rogen like the only Canadian who smokes reefer? No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Certainly the most famous. And so, yeah, there's a lot of fear mongering, a lot of scare tactics that have been used by various lobbies. But as we found in the United States, marijuana use amongst teens tends to decline, and we knew this from decades ago. The Dutch experiment, right, where they never quite legalized marijuana in Holland,
right,
but they tolerated it. It's the lowest level of law enforcement priority. The police are instructed to look away. They are not going to harass you if you go to a regulated pot shop and buy cannabis. But the Dutch have found that they had lower rates of teen use of marijuana, even though historically they've had much more liberal drug laws compared to the U.S., not currently, but historically. And I think the Dutch did something remarkable. They managed to make marijuana boring. I think that's a good slogan. It's a good objective. When you stop making it forbidden fruit, it becomes something that your parents' generation does. They can take it or leave it to kids, and it's not that cool for them anymore.
Right.
So
it takes the outlaw quality out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So it's it actually is kind of a boring drug, actually, when you think about it. So let's treat it like that. It's kind of like Facebook when your parents' generation started joining it, right? It's no longer that cool anymore.
So let's talk a bit about what's happening at the border. Because right now it seems from all the reports I've been reading that the Border Patrol, the U.S. Customs Service on the border are really being active with this and pushing people about whether they've used marijuana, not allowing people in. I'm not sure the numbers. I've read thousands. You know better than I what that is. So talk a bit about what's being set up here at the border between Canada and the U.S.
In recent months, there's been many dozens of people who've been turned away. We don't have hard numbers on these, but certainly attorneys on the border areas are dealing with a lot of clients who've been received lifetime bans. Just last week, however, Customs and Border Protection finally issued some degree of clarification about this. They had said previously that they were deliberately going to target people who worked in the cannabis industry. So even if you worked in a pot shop in Canada but didn't consume yourself, you would still be eligible for a lifetime ban from entering the United States because you're contributing to a criminal enterprise, as the federal government considers it. So they finally said they were not going to target those people explicitly if they traveled to the U.S. not on business. Right. So if they're coming to promote marijuana, they would still be banned. But if they're just coming as regular tourists, they're not going to be harassed. However, there are still lots of regs on the books still that the Customs and Border Protection can use, and they have extraordinary leeway into what questions they ask you when you attempt to enter the United States. And so they can be as obnoxious as they want, unfortunately, and sometimes they can be quite rude. So if you have long hair, if you're wearing a pot T-shirt or have some kind of anything that gives them any suspicion, or even without suspicion, they can ask you, have you ever consumed cannabis? Have you ever been arrested for cannabis? And if you answer honestly, then they can ban you still. And so that's an abomination that needs to be updated and needs to be gone from our books. This is unnecessary harassment, especially when it's legal on both sides of the border, when a lot of these border states, including Michigan and North Dakota, are voting on in November. And I think there's a chance they will pass, and certainly in Michigan, and possibly North Dakota as well. So all these border states would be legal on both sides.
So how much of this is driven by the Trump administration's obsession with being at war with Canada, with the obsession of this administration and states that legalize or medicalize marijuana, and how this kind of border action is playing into this? Because the numbers of people, I'm not sure if they're growing or not, but I know that at least 22,000 people or so have been banned from the U.S. for many reasons, maybe not just marijuana, from Canada. But so how does this all play into that?
Well, the behavior of the Trump administration towards Canada is something that's really hard to wrap your head around. Yeah, I don't like to use salty language, but the word dickish comes to mind. There's no other way to describe how utterly obnoxious and unnecessary these punitive measures are, not just with regard to marijuana, but on trade, on dairy products, on every imaginable issue. Donald Trump seems to have a very personal grudge against Canada, and it's hard to explain. And yes, Border Patrol and Customs, they've always exercised their power, and they have banned people in the past for marijuana, but it was more obvious offenses. If your car reeked of marijuana, if you were wearing a giant pot T-shirt and gave them reason to ask you those questions, yeah, they would do that in the past. But now they seem to be wanting to ramp it up and do it in a very random way. They're certainly not going to be able to, flag 40% of Canadian travelers coming to the United States. That would be just impossibly obnoxious. But they can use it as a sort of Damocles to hang over Canadian civil society. If you make social media postings about your use of cannabis, for instance, and they find that online, and there have been evidence that they're searching for that sort of thing, they can have grounds then to ban you for life. Even though you may be traveling to California or Washington State or Oregon, where it's completely legal. There's a way to get out of the lifetime ban. It involves very expensive process, and you can get a temporary waiver for I think 5 years, and it'll cost you, I think, maybe a couple $100 or $1,000 or something. But it's really obnoxious, this policy. So it seems to be that they're using this to stifle debate, to stifle progress as much as they can. The Trump administration knows this train has left the station. There's no way to stop it completely. But with Jeff Sessions and a lot of these social conservatives, they think, well, these are ways we could harass the movement to keep it from moving faster or to keep it in check or keep them in fear from speaking out.
So how does this affect our hemispheric policies and what goes on in the Western Hemisphere between Mexico and here and beyond NAFTA and more? Does this play into that at all?
So when the new president, AMLO's his acronym, takes office in December in Mexico,
yeah.
He is, being a progressive, he's already talked about legalizing marijuana in Mexico. So when you think about it, right now, you can drive from the Arctic Circle in Alaska through Canada, through Washington State, through Oregon, all the way down to the border of Mexico, and that is all legal marijuana.
I never thought about it that way, but that's right.
That is a huge shift. So
Right.
The latest Pew polls, for instance, show that 62% of Americans now favor legalization of cannabis. When I started in this field about 20 years ago, it was less than half of that. So when you think about a controversial issue, a third rail political issue, being able to double our rate of support, I didn't realize this until a week or two ago, and I really looked back and I'm like, that's incredible. For those kinds of polarizing social issues, especially when you consider that the federal government has spent more than $1 trillion in my lifetime fighting the war on drugs, a lot of it through fear tactics and propaganda, and we're still able to more than double support for marijuana legalization. That's pretty remarkable.
Well, Sanjo Trias, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I appreciate the work that you do, and look forward to continuing this and see where this takes us, and what kind of comes out of all this over the coming months. Thank you so much for joining us here in Real News, Sanjo. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And I'm Mark Steiner here for the Real News Network. Thank you for joining us. Take care.